Okay, we are talking to our state senator, Bruce Tarr. Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, Heather. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good.
We have not, in all our conversations, we have not yet discussed school reopenings and what that conversation looks like from Beacon Hill. Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. It's a very important subject for so many reasons. But I will tell you right at the outset that the view from Beacon Hill is that this is a decision that should be made at the local level by local school committees and local school administrators with the input of educators and parents and students. Because what we're seeing is that conditions can be very different from one community to another. And in fact, you saw a manifestation of that a few weeks ago when the administration started releasing a map that showed case rates in every community in the state. And that's important information to have on its own, but it's also important information to have when making decisions about things like reopening of schools. And so you may recall that the governor, at the time that map was released, or maybe just a little bit later, said that the expectation was that if communities were either shaded in white or in green on that map, meaning they have relatively low transmission rates, that the expectation would be that they have some element of in-person learning. And so the movement has been from the administration to look at much more granular information, both in terms of individual communities and their case rates, and in terms of schools, and letting schools make their decisions based on what they're seeing in the individual community. Now, that hasn't been without controversy, and there have been very heated debates in many communities about what reopening plans should look like. But the perspective, as much as I can express an overall perspective from state government, has been that those debates are properly placed in the community among the stakeholders that will be affected by the decisions, rather than trying to have a one-size-fits-all pronouncement from Beacon Hill.
Yes, and yet I have heard some people in on school committees say we would be really grateful if we didn't have to make this decision. If the government would just,
it's not an easy decision. And as I alluded to a minute ago, it has ramifications at a number of different levels. I mean, one of them obviously is public health. Another one is the efficacy of the learning. And can we in fact achieve good success with remote learning, given the fact that it's something that's relatively new as a proliferate means of teaching? There's also an economic element of it. And that is, if folks are needing to be at home to take care of kids that aren't in school, then they can't go to work, or they have to work remotely. So this plays out in so many different ways, and the burden of those decisions is very heavy. And so clearly the folks that are making those decisions feel that burden, and we're trying to do things that we can do to be helpful in terms of issuing guidance, which is coming from the administration much more than the legislature, which plays a much lesser role here in terms of the day-to-day decision making. So we're trying to be supportive, but it is important that those decisions get made. They get made at the local level, and they get made with as much inclusion as possible of different perspectives.
So I just want to touch really quickly on childcare. Is there any way the state can be supporting communities with childcare? I know everyone is struggling with that.
There is. First of all, childcare has been one of the most difficult aspects of the pandemic to try to address. And you may recall that when schools were closed back last spring, which seems now like so long ago, when they were closed, then all of the daycare facilities were closed. And there was emergency certification just for daycares that were serving emergency responders and people on the front lines of the pandemic and providing care. And that provided needed care. And I believe there are about 500 facilities that got that emergency certification around the state. But of course, that means if you didn't fit into those categories of eligibility, then you had no childcare. And it was a very difficult thing for the command center and the administration to come up with a reopening plan, because of the inherent difficulty of maintaining social distancing with kids that are that age, that would be in a daycare setting. And it's still a concerning discussion that people are having about it. So yes, there is discussion about what to do. There has been some discussion, for instance, about allowing teachers to be able to bring kids to school and have daycare in that setting. There's also discussion about the availability of CARES Act money to be able to support the operational expenses of standing up additional childcare in a community. And that seems to be going in a very positive direction. But it is a difficult thing because it's so intrinsically related to the economy and trying to get a recovery moving, because obviously if you don't have childcare, you can't go to work. And that's a very challenging situation.
Right. So I'm going to ask you this question, and I'm not sure you can answer it because we've touched on it before, but I think it's interesting for people to hear. Why are teachers not considered essential workers?
Well, I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that. There's a lot of debate about whether they should be and whether they should not be. I know that that debate has been going on, for instance, at the level of the Gloucester School Committee. And so it depends on how you look at it. And obviously, I think most of us would consider the teaching of our kids to be an essential thing, and therefore the people that conduct that essential activity as essential workers. But there are ramifications to this, and we've touched on it a little bit before, relative to collective bargaining and the impact of that definition and that classification on collective bargaining. And I would suggest that that has played significantly into the discussion and made the discussion much less straightforward than it would otherwise be, to try to figure out all of the ramifications of using that terminology. So I wish I had a better answer than that, but I will tell you, I think that explains some of the complication of the issue, which doesn't make it very easy to deal with.
Well, that is helpful still. And let's talk about one way that the state is involved in children's lives right now that is something of an issue, and that is this mandated vaccine for the flu, not the COVID, but the regular yearly flu.
So many of us got taken a bit by surprise when it was announced that as a requirement of being enrolled in school, either by remote learning or in-person learning, that every student over the age of 6 months would be required to have the seasonal flu vaccine, because that isn't something that had been discussed a lot. And so we fielded, for instance, a lot of questions in our office, either by phone or by email, by folks saying, was there any public process around this? What authority was there to make that requirement? And while you would assume that maybe it was done as a public health emergency declaration, as so many things have been during the time of the pandemic, it actually wasn't. There is a statute in Massachusetts that says as a condition of school enrollment, you have to have certain vaccinations. And there are many that we're familiar with, Heather, like measles, mumps, and rubella, and some others that have just been traditional childhood vaccinations. But the statute also says any other vaccination that can be for contagious disease that can be added from time to time by the Department of Public Health. And so there already was a statute that allowed the Department of Public Health, as a matter of routine, to make that determination. And there is a regulation that's underneath that statute. And the regulation cites a particular panel within the Centers for Disease Control and makes reference to the fact that the requirements in Massachusetts will take into account what that panel says at the Centers for Disease Control. And lo and behold, a couple of months ago, that group made the determination that every child 6 months or older should have the influenza vaccine. And so while it did come onto the scene very quickly, there actually is a lot of depth to this issue, and we're still trying to sort it out. And it seems like it would have been a prudent thing to have a little bit more notice, a little bit more discussion of this, but there is a statutory basis for it. Now, as to the reason that it's being sought, it seems that part of it is the concern that if there is a resurgence of COVID-19, then that's going to place a strain on our healthcare system. And if that's coincidental with a resurgence or widespread outbreak of influenza, then that will further tax the system. And so it would be prudent to try to minimize the onset of the flu and the spread of the flu, while at the same time we're trying to look very carefully at COVID-19. So that's the rationale for it. But again, it's raised a lot of concern, and we're still working through this issue. And I know many legislators are, because folks have raised concern about it.
And in the past, there have been shortages of flu vaccines, right? Are we prepared for this?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't have an answer to that. And also, I know in years past, there have been a couple of different vaccines. For instance, I believe last flu season, there was A and B, and one was advanced over the other, and that one didn't necessarily correlate to the flu that we actually saw. So when you're developing the vaccine, you're trying to anticipate which flu that you might see, which form of influenza, and that's not always a perfect science. So there are a lot of questions here about this, and it adds another dimension, because again, we've all been focused primarily, and rightly so, on COVID-19, and now we're thinking about flu, just like we've been thinking about Eastern equine encephalitis and West Nile virus. And those haven't developed as much as we had feared, but we did have to think about those too, as summer advanced, and we had to think about mosquito-borne illness.
Okay, I have one more question about this vaccine. If this is something that is emerging out of the CDC, are there other states that are adopting this policy?
I don't know the answer to that yet, but that would seem to be a likely conclusion. And I will just add another question that's been asked is, if we're going to require students to have the vaccine, what about the folks that are working in the schools? So what about educators and staff people? Should they be required to have it? So again, there are a number of questions around this, and that's why we're still trying to process what has happened and think about what should happen.
Well, let's move on to more local subjects maybe, and that is the weekend approaching. And this show will air perhaps after this weekend, but it's still relevant. So let's talk about the celebration of retail this weekend.
No, it's a really important thing, and I know, you know, that's one of the attributes of 1623 and the work that you do, is talking about our community and the stakeholders in our community, the importance of local businesses for a whole host of reasons. And that is critically important right now, because we see the challenges that particularly restaurants and retailers have faced. And retailers really have dealt with some very serious challenges, and particularly local retailers that have a brick and mortar store that's trying to compete in the era of a pandemic with online sales. So we try to find everything we can do to help them, but the sales tax holiday is actually not a new element. It first began, I believe it was back in 2005. So it's not a new tool, but it's a tool that has been used in just about every year since 2005. I think we missed 2 years in the time between now and then. And the idea originally started because folks wanted to do something in the late summer as school season, school reopening was approaching, to be able to help parents be able to afford school supplies and all the things that their kids needed, while at the same time giving a boost to local businesses. And so, you know, that has continued, but the way that it used to work was very different than the way that it works now. It used to be that the sales tax holiday had to be legislated every year by the legislature with the approval of the governor. And there was always this idea of doing it at the last minute to maintain an element of surprise, so that consumers wouldn't pre-plan their purchases or defer purchases until the time of the sales tax holiday.
It's kind of what everybody does.
Exactly. Well, but the fact of the matter is that if you looked at the history of the sales tax holiday, we really weren't surprising anyone. Everyone knew that it was going to be either one weekend or the other.
Right.
And, you know, I don't think, I think it would have to be someone that was extremely naive that would be surprised in Massachusetts that there was going to be a sales tax holiday, you know, in the middle of August. So But that changed. And it changed with the so-called grand bargain a couple of years ago when it was done along with paid family and medical leave and a couple of other things. And as part of that grand bargain, the sales tax holiday became permanent. And what did remain was the legislature has so much time to decide the date. And if it doesn't, it defaults to the administration. And that's in fact what happened this year. It was not, the date was not legislated. It was a decision made by the administration. It is, depending on when you're watching this, it's either right now, this weekend, or it has just happened. And,
Right.
And we hope that it will have been a successful one. And you know, Heather, this is not without a cost. So generally speaking, the sales tax holiday foregoes about $20 to $25 million in sales tax revenue for the state. And that is a lot of money when you think about the state budget, but you have to weigh that in context of the importance of keeping our local employers and our local businesses thriving. And that is critically important because they are essential to our local economy. And so money that perhaps isn't being collected by the state, but is rather being retained by consumers, does have a public policy benefit and does have a benefit that sometimes is hard to quantify, but it's certainly not zero.
Mm. So I think the theme here is shop local,
Yes.
right?
And it very much is. And, you know, this is an opportunity to purchase things without the sales tax, but it's also an opportunity to think about just how important it is to shop locally and to patronize our local businesses for the things that we need and maybe the things that we might have put off and said, well, I'm not ready to buy this yet. Maybe I'll buy it next year. Well, now's a really good time, if you can afford it, to buy those things now and be able to help our Main Street businesses.
And I will remind people that if anyone is still nervous about shopping, so many of these local businesses have moved online also. So you can still support a local business by shopping online with from their website.
You can, and you can still benefit from the sales tax holiday.
Right.
So as long as the online purchase is made during the time frame of the sales tax holiday, then the sales tax is still not applied. So,
well, yeah. If this airs next week, I think it probably will. I hope there are a whole bunch of new lawnmowers and washing machines and everything in people's homes.
Well, you never know, Heather. We could be being watched on many new large screen televisions over the sales tax holiday. And, you know, I hope they make us look fabulous.
I do too. I don't want to be life size, but that's okay. If it's in the name of, you know, supporting our economy, it's okay. So.
I would point out, however, that the tax holiday, the tax forgiveness is capped at $2,500. So that each TV that you buy has to be for less than $2,500 or up to $2,500. However, if you buy multiple TVs, each one is tax exempt up to the $2,500.
There you go. So a TV in every room.
Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to be able to watch 1623 Studios programming from every room in your house?
There you go. All right. Well, let's end on that note. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to share some thought